A woman and her 2 daughters disappear mysteriously. Her husband, with whom she was perceived to have the perfect marriage with, was unbothered, claiming they had a slight altercation, which could have prompted her to disappear temporarily. However, the inquisitive nature of concerned neighbors, the CCTV device of a security-cautious neighbor, and the expertise of high-profile detectives all combined together to unravel a mystery, one in which, when the manner of killing and the places of burial were discovered, beat imaginations and messed with radical thinking. Chris Watts met Shannan Rusek in 2010 through Facebook. Shannan had been dealing with health issues and was initially hesitant about starting a relationship. However, Chris's patience and support won her over. They started dating, and their relationship quickly became serious. They got married on November 3, 2012 in Charlotte, North Carolina. They eventually moved to Frederick, Colorado, where they built a life together and had 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste. On August 13, 2018, Shannan Watts returned home from a business trip after being away for a few days. She could be seen entering her apartment, looking tired. However, that footage would later become the last living activity of Shannan ever recorded. For some reason, Shannan's friend, Nicole, started panicking and came back to the house looking for Shannan, having not heard from her as planned the previous day. When Nicole got to the house, she was met with some footprints of events that suggested something had happened to her friend. Her car was still packed outside. Her shoe was seen at the doorpost, and her packed bag was still visible, which suggested Shannan was supposed to be in the house. However, she wasn't, and no one saw her coming out either. Tensions had begun rising at this point. Initially, Chris and Shannan's marriage was classified as the perfect one. They had beautiful children, great careers, and also a baby on the way. Chris was really crazy in love with his wife, to the extent that he would usually leave her romantic love notes on random occasions. However, Chris's and Shannan's marriage, like any love story, was beginning to have its bumps and hurdles. Ones which involved Chris's parents being at a crossroads with Shannan and not accepting her totally, and this she expressed to her friend Shane via Facebook. Chris, who was an introvert, with Shannan being the total opposite, was now becoming a very dominant figure in her life. Text messages shared between both of them revealed that Chris was beginning to express displeasure at the fact that Shannan was pregnant with another child. Chris's alibi was that he just got home from work and they were gone just like that. He claimed he didn't have the slightest clue as to where they would have gone. However, there was something noticeable about Chris's attitude which suggested otherwise. Chris's behavior was one that fluctuated from him being calm to one who became shaky in nature. He didn't express the slightest remorse, and whenever he referred to his girls, he usually did so in a past tense, which suggested that he was already mourning a loss. But they have only been declared missing, and a father who claimed to love his family like Chris claimed would hold on to every last hope he could. However, this was not the case with Chris, which suggested he knew something about their disappearance, something which may involve them never coming back. However, what the detectives were about to find out became an increasingly crucial finding in the case. During the visit to Chris's house, police saw a camera on the neighbor's house and inquired to see what it had captured. The neighbor showed the officers a footage of what his CCTV had recorded in the early hours of the day of their disappearance. There was no footage of Shannan leaving the premises with the girls. However, it does show Chris loading something into the back of his truck before eventually driving off. Detectives knew they had an important piece of this shocking case and had to invite Chris immediately to explain scenes in the footage. On seeing this footage, Chris began offering some unnecessary explanations, while also giving off a tense attitude. The fact that he wasn't asked for the explanations he was giving, coupled with his shaky nature, gave onlookers the impression that he wasn't entirely innocent. Most people felt that as a man who just lost a family he claimed to love, he should be at the forefront of the footage, probably rewinding and pausing it with eyes wide open in order to look for possible leads that may enable him to know the whereabouts of his family. However, he didn't give any such reaction. Instead, he was busy trying to defend his whereabouts and activities after he drove away.
Loading my stuff up in my coolers, my water jugs, my book bag, my computers, some of the tools that I had from the toolbox. I knew I was going to have to do some pumping into rubbers today. That's why I was out so far.
Chris may have thought he fooled everyone with his explanations, or probably they just let him believe that. However, one person wasn't holding back on his doubts and suspicions. Chris's neighbor insisted that Chris's actions caught on camera showed that he was hiding something he didn't want to be seen, because the whole time, he never came out in the open, knowing fully well there was a CCTV device monitoring the environment, and he placed his activities so strategically that the details were never fully captured. He also reiterated his suspicions, claiming that Chris was an introvert and one who never really talked, so the fact that he was trying so hard to defend himself denoted guilt, and that there was something he didn't want anyone to know about. It had become increasingly obvious that Chris was at the core of this case, especially with the event of him loading his truck suspiciously and his weird behaviors during the interviews. The detectives had already begun to interrogate him and made him the prime suspect. Whilst searching for Shannan and her two daughters, Bella and Celeste, Chris was eventually face to face with an investigator in which he constantly denied knowing the whereabouts of his wife and daughters. For the better part of the interrogation, Chris seemed really confident. But these were professionals, and should Chris be one of those hardened criminals hard to break, they needed to be ready, and that meant not letting their guards down. And when the investigators saw they couldn't break the truth out of him, they suggested a polygraph test, which he readily agreed. It is important to note that at this point, Chris is not guilty. However, due to the mischievous nature of his recent behaviors, and owing to the fact that he was the last person to have come in contact with the missing people, he became a primary suspect, hence the need for the drilling. After agreeing to the polygraph test, he was urged to come back the following morning when the test would take place. The next day arrived pretty soon, and the investigator explained all the details he needed to know about the test. She began by asking him to lie about basic stuff, which he did, and she announced him as a terrible liar, which meant his polygraph test would be seamless. Little did he know she was just a smart detective in action. The test commenced, and usually, a polygraph test is considered a negative result following a -4 score. But Chris failed the polygraph test so badly that his score was at a bottom rate of -18. At this moment, investigators began to pressure him to divulge the truth, because with the highly negative result of the test, there was no chance he wasn't lying the whole time. Chris's stance remained the same, claiming he was going through some psychological stress, and the fact that he had failed the test proves nothing. But these intelligent detectives had other plans. In a bid to test Chris's resolve and the unwavering nature of his stories, they questioned his fidelity status, in which he claimed he was clean and had been a faithful husband. Unknown to him, detectives were aware of an ongoing relationship between him and a lady called Nikki Kessinger, with whom he had been having romantic dealings with over the months. But the detectives didn't break the news just yet. They wanted to test Chris's resolve, and after some hours of intense questioning, he finally gave in, admitting to the relationship. He claimed he felt ashamed for his actions, owing to the fact that his wife was pregnant and has been good to him. He also claimed that was one of the reasons why when she questioned him about the affair, he blatantly denied it. This was the first major progress they had made in getting the truth from Chris. However, the detectives knew there was more, and they were ready to give Chris as much time he needed to process and divulge the information they were seeking. The investigators kept wondering how his wife and his two kids had mysteriously disappeared, and they relayed that question to him. But he kept on denying, swearing and claiming he didn't know where his family was and that he was the victim. However, this patient detective decided to take the next major step. There is a technique in investigation called the John Reed technique, where the detective acts as a friend to the suspect, making them feel good about themselves and eliminating every trace of blame, and making them believe they understand why they must have committed the act, all in a bid to make them comfortable and further bring out a confession. The investigators used this technique against Chris immediately. They first accused him of not shedding a tear at all, but Chris continued to reiterate that it doesn't prove anything. The detectives then cut to the chase. They went straight to plan. They offered him a way out, accusing Shannan of killing the children, and imposed that on him as a probable reason why he killed her. He denied not knowing if she did anything to the kids, maintaining his ignorance of the situation. As of August 15, 2018, which was 2 days after they had mysteriously disappeared, Chris Watts was still maintaining his stand on not knowing where they had disappeared to or having a hand in it. Meanwhile, a scan had earlier revealed the gender of the baby Chris and Shannan were both expecting, and they named him Nico. With Chris's denial, the whereabouts of Shannan, their 2 daughters, and their unborn baby remained unknown. The detectives then came up with another very smart decision. They offered a better way out. They inquired if Chris would love to talk to someone he was comfortable with, someone like his father. Chris immediately took the offer. This would signify the next milestone of truth since the inception of this case. He told his father that he had brought the idea of a separation to Shannan, which she didn't take lightly, and that she expressed her rage by killing their 2 girls, which prompted him to kill her in return. After which, he buried her in a shallow grave and disposed of the girls in an oil tank at a site near his workplace. The investigators, on hearing this, knew they were close to the answers they were looking for. However, they still didn't believe his story, as Shannan didn't fit the character he tried to portray her as. Also, most people in that situation would most likely call the cops and not kill their spouse and dispose all of the bodies. Investigators located the bodies of Bella and Celeste in oil tanks on the property of Anadarko Petroleum, where Chris worked. The tanks were about 20 feet tall and contained crude oil. The recovery process, which began at about 10 p.m., took 1 hour before Shannan's body was eventually found and exhumed. It was found in a curled state, as though it was just thrown in. The process of recovering the girls, which was the hardest part, was about to follow. However, that needed proper planning, owing to the dangerous environment in which the girls were placed. This process took a whopping 14 hours. It was overseen by an employee of the oil company in which the bodies were located. They started off with the east tank, which contained about 9 feet of crude oil. When the tank was opened, the investigators had counted if any of the girls would have been able to pass through the opening due to its minute nature. But thankfully, they saw a blonde hair at the entrance, which suggested that the girls were forced right through it. At first, they would manually drain the tanks into another tank through a metal screen, where they could monitor it for any evidence that may pass through. Once the tanks were empty, they were deployed in 2s, wearing completely protective materials, one that protected them from hazardous substances. Even at that, they could only remain in each of the tanks for specific minutes, which would be followed by complete detoxification owing to the severity of the hazard emitted. In the east tank, they located Celeste, who was still in her nightgown and her diaper, covered with crude oil. The same process was repeated for Bella, who was bigger than Celeste. Nicole Kessinger, Chris Watts' mistress, provided a detailed account of her relationship with Chris during interviews with law enforcement. Kessinger first met Chris in June 2018 at Anadarko Petroleum, where they both worked. She was under the impression that he was separated from his wife Shannan, and in the process of divorcing, a lie Chris maintained until the murders were discovered. During their affair, which escalated quickly, Kessinger and Chris spent significant time together while Shannan and their daughters were away visiting family. Kessinger believed Chris's claims and even considered a future with him, evident from her Google searches on topics like wedding dresses and marrying your mistress. In her police interview, conducted 3 days after the murders, Kessinger expressed shock and horror upon learning the truth about Chris's family situation and his actions. She cooperated fully with investigators, providing insight into her relationship with Chris and his behavior, even though she added some irregularities, like her deleting all her messages and every trace of her relationship with Chris, or denying not knowing his wife's name. Kessinger revealed that Chris had continued to contact her even after his family was reported missing, seeking reassurance about their relationship. She ultimately decided to end the affair, suspecting that something was terribly wrong. In one of their final exchanges, Chris sent her a message that Kessinger interpreted as a farewell. She responded with a warning, telling him that if he had done something bad, it would ruin both of their lives. Chris replied, denying any harm to his family. This was the last communication before his arrest. However, the question on everyone's lips remained, how did the murders really happen? Chris Watts provided a detailed confession about the murders of his wife Shannan and their 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste, during a 5-hour interview with law enforcement on February 18, 2019. Chris claimed that the tragedy unfolded early in the morning of August 13, 2018. He said that he and Shannan argued after he confessed to having an affair and wanting to separate. In a fit of rage and desperation, Watts strangled Shannan to death in their bedroom. After killing Shannan, Chris said that Bella walked in and saw him wrapping her mother's body in a sheet. He carried Shannan's body to his truck and loaded Bella and Celeste into the vehicle. During the 45-minute drive to an oil field, Chris considered taking his own life, but decided against it. At the oil field, Chris buried Shannan in a shallow grave. He then smothered Celeste with her blanket while Bella watched. After placing Celeste's body in an oil tank, he returned to the truck and smothered Bella, who fought back, pleading, "Daddy, no," before he killed her and placed her body in another oil tank. Chris Watts was arrested on August 15, 2018, and charged with multiple counts, including first-degree murder and unlawful termination of a pregnancy. You would recall that Chris falsely claimed that Shannan had killed their daughters, leading him to kill her in rage. However, facing overwhelming evidence, he eventually confessed to all the murders. On November 6, 2018, Chris pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. His plea deal was influenced by Shannan's family desire to avoid prolonged legal proceedings and further emotional trauma. Chris was sentenced on November 19, 2018, to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, Shannan's parents, Frank and Sandra Rusek, made emotional statements. Despite the enormity of Chris's crimes, they expressed forgiveness, largely influenced by their faith. They emphasized their desire to honor Shannan and the girls by choosing forgiveness over hatred, hoping it would bring them some measure of peace. Chris's parents also spoke, expressing their forgiveness and sorrow. This approach was rooted in their religious beliefs and the understanding that forgiveness was a crucial step in their healing process. However, Chris's mother wasn't having any of these. Chris Watts' mother, Cindy Watts, publicly expressed her disapproval of her son's decision to accept a plea deal. She believed Chris was coerced into pleading guilty to the murders of his wife Shannan, their 2 daughters Bella and Celeste, and the unlawful termination of Shannan's pregnancy. Cindy felt that Chris should have fought the charges instead of pleading guilty to avoid the death penalty. Cindy Watts shared her concerns in interviews, revealing that she and her husband Ronnie were only allowed limited contact with Chris following the arrest. They were given brief visits and felt shut out of discussions regarding the plea deal. Cindy stated that she couldn't reconcile the violent acts Chris was accused of with the son she knew, and she struggled to accept the narrative presented by the prosecution. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Cindy believed Chris should have pursued a not guilty plea and fought the charges in court. But something remained lingering. From someone as deceptive as Watts, there was a possibility that the full story never came to light. Shannan Cadle, an author and true crime enthusiast, became involved with Chris Watts' case after she reached out to him in prison. Cadle and Watts began corresponding in early 2019, with their exchange resulting in hundreds of letters and phone calls. Cadle visited Watts in prison multiple times as she worked on her book, Letters from Christopher, The Tragic Confessions of the Watts Family Murders. In her book, Cadle reveals disturbing details from Watts about the murders, which he had not disclosed during initial police investigations. Watts described in detail how he had premeditated the murders and the gruesome manner in which he killed his pregnant wife, Shannan, and their 2 younger daughters, Bella and Celeste. Watts admitted to attempting to smother his daughters twice and described the horrific final moments of their lives. Cadle's involvement brought additional public attention to the case, particularly following the release of the Netflix documentary, American Murder: The Family Next Door. Her book provided a deeper insight into Watts' psyche and his confessions, revealing his twisted rationale and the calculated nature of his crimes. Watts initially cooperated with Cadle, allowing her to use his letters for the book. However, after the book's publication, he expressed regret and dissatisfaction with how his story was presented. Despite this, Cadle has maintained that her intention was never to justify his actions, but to provide a truthful account of the horrific events. We would love to know your thoughts on this case. Being one of the most heart-wrenching cases we have ever covered, your comments would be much needed. Please do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Do well to turn on post notifications so as not to miss thriller cases such as this. Till our next case, it's bye for now.